Today we're going to learn how to name compounds and write formulas. There are four actual types of compounds that we're going to learn how to name and write formulas for, but today we're going to focus on ionic compounds and possibly covalent compounds. Your ionic compounds typically are made up of a metal and a nonmetal. These are what are referred to as a binary type, meaning that you've got only two types of elements. So if you look down here, this is a metal, nonmetal. That would be a binary type. Metal, nonbinary. It's still binary because I only have two types of elements on the compound. Or you can have a polyatomic ion. So if you have more than two symbols in your formula, then you know that you've got a polyatomic ion somewhere in there. Now, a polyatomic ion is basically going to be a group of atoms with a charge. And you should memorize about 20 or 20 so of these particular ones. And I'll put out a list or send you a list of those if you need them. But in this particular case, the OH, for example, stands for the hydroxide ion. And the hydroxide ion always has a -1 charge. The charges are going to be important when you're writing the formulas because you have to make sure that your overall compound is neutral or has a 0 overall charge. Our second kind of compounds are called covalent compounds. These are typically made up of two nonmetals. So here you have two nonmetals in each of these various types of compounds. These are also referred to as molecular compounds as well. We're going to do these after we do ionic compounds, however. When you're looking at ionic compounds, these are held together by a specific kind of force that's called an ionic bond. And these types of bonds, one element, which is the metal, is going to donate electrons to another element, which is the nonmetal. The metal, if it's donating electrons, it creates a positive ion, which is referred to as a cation. So that's your positive ion. And then, because metals, remember, tend to want to lose electrons. So if you go back and look at the periodic table we did earlier, then you saw that the first column had a +1 charge because all those were metals that had one valence electron and tended to want to lose that one electron to gain their octet. And then your other elements, or your nonmetals, are going to be your anions, which are your negative ions, because they tend to want to gain them. These, remember, are on the right-hand side of the table, so things like fluorine and oxygen tended to want to gain electrons in order to gain their octet. We're going to skip this for now. We'll come back and look at some of those now. So then we're going to look at some ionic compounds. And we've already talked a little bit about your polyatomic ions. So let's look at this handout. One of the things you want to be able to do is determine whether you have ionic or covalent bonding. So let me go back. I guess we do need to go over that slide just real quick. When you're looking at covalent bonds, you're going to have sharing of electrons. So there's two different types of sharing. You can either have equal sharing or unequal sharing. If you have unequal sharing, that means you have two different kinds of elements. So one element, the bigger element of the two, in this case oxygen, will contain or hold those electrons more than the hydrogen gets to. So therefore, it's an unequal sharing. For a covalent bond, non-polar covalent bond, you have equal sharing and you have to have like electrons, like elements. So if we look at these, we're looking at types of bonds you might have. So if I'm looking at the very first one, you can see that I have a metal with a nonmetal. So I have metal and a nonmetal. That is going to be an ionic bond. If I look at the next one, you have two nonmetals, so this is going to form a covalent bond. So you don't really have to know whether it's polar covalent or nonpolar covalent. So the third one, you have hydrogen, which is a nonmetal, oxygen, which is a nonmetal, so it will also be a covalent bond. Now if you look at letter number 4, you actually have 3 elements. So we have a polyatomic ion here, and we have a metal here. So our metal to our polyatomic ion, the bond that would be in here would actually be an ionic bond. And this is how you would name these, is by the ionic naming, because you have what's called a polyatomic ion, so you name it as the ionic kind. But within the polyatomic ion here, you actually have a covalent bond, because you have 2 nonmetals put together. So in any of these that have 3 or more symbols or elements, you know you're going to have both types of bonds. So if I look on down, the next one that would actually have both types of bonds would be number 7, because I have a metal with a polyatomic ion. So in between here I'd have a ionic bond, between here I would have covalent bonds. If I'm looking down in this chart, so what would number 8 be? I have a carbon and a hydrogen, both of these are nonmetals, so that's going to make this a covalent bond. And what about the last one? On the last one, on this one, metal with a nonmetal, that makes it ionic.